The JCIPP is the hashtag, is the event code for us today. So you can submit a question or like somebody else's question, and then I'll facilitate the questions and answer session at the end of Cantor's presentation. But today we're finally using technology to its fullest extent, or at least to a greater extent than we have in the past, because you can also use Slido to conduct polling of the audience, of the participants. And so Cantor has decided to be bold and move out into that direction. So we're going to conduct, or she'll be conducting a couple of polls during her presentation. So that really does depend upon you, the audience, participating. So you'll get talked through it as we go. Somewhere in the middle of the presentation, there'll be a poll, and then another one a few minutes later. We'll share the results with you as it happens in real time, but to do it, you have to be on Slido. So please, once again, go to slido.com or go and download the app, and then we'll do the poll. And our hashtag JCIPP is our event code. So please go to Slido at some stage in the next little while. Now, on to today's presentation, and to introduce our speaker, Dr. Cantor Dayaram. Cantor is an associate professor in industrial relations at the School of Management and Marketing in the Faculty of Business and Law at Curtin University here. She's got a doctorate in public policy and governance, and she has a dual master's in leadership and health economics from the LSE in London. And she teaches and researches in industrial relations and policy regulation and work and health outcomes. She's written various articles for the Conversation website, if ever you go to that website, including reporting on some of the research that she's going to be discussing today at the Conversation. So I heartily recommend you go to the Conversation and you look up Cantor's work there, and you can read some of the articles that she's written. So Cantor, it's great to have you on board. Thanks very much for agreeing and to be our speaker today, and we're looking forward to your presentation. And I'll now turn off my screen and I'll turn off my volume, and then as we go through, we'll get to the bit about the polling, and then we'll maybe see how it all works, but I'm sure it'll be fine. So over to you, Cantor. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And I too would like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. And I extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are logged in here today. And thank you again, John, for this opportunity to be able to discuss post-COVID-19 and the rights of workers in a time of flexible work arrangements. And so, you know, you've read a lot, we've seen a lot, but what COVID-19 has actually done is let the genie out, because flexible work arrangements have been in place for some time now in various forms. But with COVID-19, we saw this mass transition to flexible work that became possible. Now, if you look at some of these figures from the Australian Bureau of Standards, we had, or statistics rather, in 2019, we had less than a third of Australians regularly working from home. But in 2020, between April and May, and you know, for lots of us who can recall, that was when we had this onset of community transmission and this very, very quick transition to remote work. And we saw during that time, 46% of Australian workers transitioned to working from home or working remotely. But before we go into that bit, I'll just give you a brief outline of what this presentation will cover. So I'm sure most of you would be familiar with the Australian Industrial Relations Framework, but so we'll just kind of cover that as a context within which to see where flexible work arrangements actually sit, and then the differences between the national coverage and the state coverage, and you know, where we follow a bit of a pyramid system, and then we'll go into some of the minimum entitlements that workers have access to, flexible work arrangements and the right to request, as well as I will share some of our research findings And while we know of the benefits, there are also lots of challenges that come with this. And what does this mean, or the consequences it has for regulation as we move post-COVID? And so just looking at the breadth of the legislation, you would see right at the very bottom as the basic foundation sits the Fair Work Act 2009. Now, within Western Australia, we've got the Industrial Relations Act of 1979. We'll go a little into that just now in the next slide. But alongside these acts sit a whole lot of other mechanisms, and that forms our basic framework. And for instance, we've got the Age Discrimination Act that sits alongside Fair Work Act, and then we've got the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which has recently been amended, and it will be implemented in 2022. And then we've also got common law, breach of contract, duty of care. So when we're talking about this dual system that we have in Australia, by and large, we do have the national system, which, as we know, is enshrined. We've got basically sort of following the Fair Work Act as such. And like I said, it's the very basic foundation on which it is. Now, the national system actually covers constitutional corporations. So all those organizations that don't meet that particular criteria or definition, and this is only within Western Australia, they would fall under the West Australian Industrial Relations Act. And those would be basically sole traders, partnerships, trusts, etc. But in other states, and when we're looking at coverage, for instance, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, for them it won't be the sole trader, etc. It would only be the state public sector organizations and local government. And in Tasmania, it would be just the state public sector. So WA is a little unique, but in saying that, even within WA, although the coverage is a bit wider as compared to the other states, between 21% and 31% of West Australian employees actually fall under the state regulation. So the coverage really for the majority of Australian workers would be the national system, which is the Fair Work Act 2009. Now, within that particular framework, we have this sort of pyramid system, all right? So right at the bottom is the Fair Work Act. And the unique thing with the Australian system is that the industrial relations legislation is actually enshrined in the Constitution. It doesn't necessarily make reference to the Fair Work Act per se, but the Constitution contains that. So in a way, that's a very good thing because we'll always have this as a protection. And so then comes this National Employment Standards, and above it sits the modern awards. We used to have over 1,000 awards, and that's been sort of curtailed to 121, which is now called the modern awards. And above it sits enterprise agreements, which a lot of you would be familiar with. And then comes the common law contracts. And so let's go back to looking at flexible work arrangements and where that sits. We used to have 10, and now we've got 11 entitlements because more recently we've had the conversion from casual to permanent employment, which extended that. But coming back to request for flexible work arrangements, that is an entitlement that sits as one of those minimum employment standards. So if you're looking at that as one of those national employment standards that's sort of at the very basic level, you would assume it should be covering all Australian employees, all right? So when we look at it with flexible work arrangements and the request or the right to request for that, and the fact that it sits within the National Employment Standards, it doesn't just include hours of work. It could be patterns of work, you know, split shifts or job sharing, as well as requesting the right to either work from home or remote work away from a co-located central workplace. So it could take various forms. And so what we're kind of looking at today, and this is where we'll do a little poll. Now, I just want to reiterate, as John said, we're going to be taking this poll using Slido. I would like to reiterate that this is anonymous. So, you know, whatever you say is very anonymous. All that we're interested in is looking at the stats. How many of you fit within this category? So at this point, I will stop sharing mine and ask Lisa to share her screen so we can see what the poll results are like.
Thanks, Cantor. Whoops, sorry. Just letting people know. Just go onto Slido.com or download the app. I've already got 11 people who have done that, so more people can do that. And you go to JCIPP is our event registration, and there you'll find that poll. And as Cantor says, it's completely anonymous. We don't know who you are, so you can vote away, and then we just want to get a rough idea, and then Cantor will sort of discuss the answers. And in a little while, there'll also be another poll, so just do what you can. And as you can see there, you can get to see some of the answers already, some of those answers, to some of those questions. So we'll give another minute, Cantor, and then...
Yes, let's do that.
Okay. As far as I can tell, there's about 30 people out there, and we've had about half of the people responded. So that's not a bad outcome. So that's good. So these are the things we should be able to do with Slido. We haven't been doing it up to now, so it's great that you're forcing us into the modern world, Cantor. We've already, we moved into going online through Zoom, and then we've moved into Slido. Now we're actually using some of the capabilities of Slido. I can tell some of the people who are plugged in, some of my mates are probably sitting there saying, John, you're so untech. So for those of you out there, you can see we're trying to get with the strength, okay? Okay, I think we're just about done. I think we're up to half the response, so leave it there. So Cantor, you maybe just talk about the answers now before Lisa stops sharing the screen and get an idea of what you've got there.
Absolutely. And so all of us can see this. Now, what's really interesting, we were saying that the National Employment Standards is the minimum in terms of entitlement to Australian employees or workers, right? And so under that, if we look at this particular polling results, we would see that we've got 29% of our participants this afternoon saying that none of these criteria apply to them. So Lisa, if you can stop sharing, I will go back and share my screen.
But you've got a lot of oldies. 55% of the people are older than 55, Cantor. So the Age Discrimination Act must apply to them, I'm assuming.
All right. I can see where you're going with this, John. But this is very interesting, right? So we saw 29% who said that they did not fall under this particular criteria. If we go back to the right to request for flexible work arrangements, that particular piece of the National Employment Standard says, for employees working for 12 months, they must meet one of these criteria. They can meet more than one. And so really fantastic for all your buddies and our participants here who indicated 55 and older. It means you have the right to request for flexible work arrangements because you fall under one of these categories. But what happens to our 29% of participants this evening? You can do one of these. Your rights to flexible work arrangements are usually either set out in an enterprise agreement, or if you have one of your industry awards, then it's you've got some protection there. But if it is not in either of those, then unfortunately, you're out of luck. What that basically means is that minimum standard that we have, unfortunately, leaves out a part of the workforce, the Australian workforce. Now, this is where, in our research with some colleagues, and we had done this during the, that sudden shift to remote work, what we had a very senior person say, it was common within our HR department. Like, we noticed that some of us could request for flexible work arrangements, and we did enjoy the benefit of flexible work arrangements. But I don't think that was extended to all. And so for those of you sitting here today, you're asking yourself, that 29%, if you're not covered under the National Employment Standard, you want to go back and see whether you're covered under the industry award or whether your enterprise agreement has it. All right? But so that's one that we're looking at. But then comes this other bit, which is the ledge, right? So you have the right as an employee to request for flexible work arrangements. And this doesn't necessarily mean that working remotely away from a co-located workspace. It could be change in shift, change in work hours, rather than 9 to 5, doing it 8 to 4, whatever it is, right? But your request doesn't necessarily mean, although you have the right as an entitlement, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is always going to be accepted, because the employer then also has the right on reasonable business grounds to reject that request based on it's either too costly, it can't be made to fit within the working arrangements of other employees because it's going to inconvenience somebody else, it's just not practical to accommodate, and will result in significant loss of productivity. Now, one can understand reasonable if it is certain types of organizations where, yeah, it's going to negatively impact another colleague. But on the other hand, you might question, how does an employee know what is too costly? So if the employee has been rejected that particular request, then the burden falls on that very employee to challenge the reason. So you're going to be asking, well, if the employee is challenging that reason on business grounds, then Fair Work Commission has the power to adjudicate. But this generally happens again if either the employment contract, it could be within, it could be in the enterprise agreement, or it could be in some other agreement, or in some cases it might even be in the award. But if it doesn't exist there, then unfortunately that's not where the Fair Work will be able to adjudicate, which then leaves the burden of being able to challenge that back on the employee. So the question then comes, are reasonable business grounds too broad a definition? Because how would an employee know whether it's not practical and what the cost is? And does the employee have access to knowing about what's productivity and how significant that impact is going to be? So there we have that one bit. But on the other hand, COVID did show us that there's been this possibility of mass transition. And what we have seen is that, and from our polling results, we've seen 29% of our participants this afternoon also indicate, similar to this very senior HR manager, I don't have kids. And before COVID, I did not think about working from home. Now, I would like to do it at least for one day. And definitely I can see 100%, I'm able to get my work done, right? And so very similar to this particular respondent of ours in our survey saying this, within Europe, the Eurostat shows us that there's been an increase as a result of COVID with the number of people transitioning to working from home. And as you can see here in Finland, there's been almost 25%. In the UK, it's been close to 48% of employees shifting to remote work. And it could be, you know, the terminologies can vary: working from home, working remotely, teleworkability, etc. Of course, for a fair few of them, this has then meant it's been quite beneficial because, again, a number of research studies have shown us that there are benefits to flexible work arrangements in terms of flexibility with time allocation, supporting work-life balance, being able to drop off kids at a certain time. It's also been beneficial for retaining talent because we've seen more women who take on caring responsibilities able to return to the workplace or be able to stay on in the workplace and enjoy the benefits of that entitlement. It also contributes to women's economic independence. It's allowed mature age workers to extend their working life. For the environment, it's really been beneficial because it's less commute time, it means less transport, and of course, it's had reduced environmental impact. In terms of real estate costs, it's significantly helped the employer because you would find, especially if you're looking at public sector, you know, agencies, etc., they tend to rent in very prime locations, etc. And this then means now there's going to be that real estate cost benefits falling back to the employer. So it does come with having those benefits. And one of our participants said, oh, look, you know, there's a higher uptake because people have seen it happen. And organizations are going to see substantial savings on real estate. There's access to a broader talent pool, etc. However, with those benefits and alongside it come a number of challenges. And some of these challenges we've seen have been around work intensification, a lot more work now, longer working hours, and that's a number of studies showing us that. There's also this intrusiveness. You know, for instance, we're having these Zoom meetings and you're able to see into people's homes. You're seeing, you know, pets sort of running across and kitties coming over and, you know, that kind of thing. So there's been a lot of that. But with these longer working hours, there's also the challenge of underpayment and free labor. And we've got ethicists who are now questioning this free labor and what does this mean? We're also seeing signaling behaviors, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and what this means. Now, let's just look at what some of our respondents said. I don't know what the proportion is, but my workload increased. I work more. And another one said, I have a concern with the remote work and the expectation to work while sick, because previously in a co-located workspace, if somebody was ill, they would take time off and rest at home. But now if they're already at home, is there that expectation that while they're resting, then it's a matter of responding to work emails using their smartphone? Another one said, in my previous place of employment, which was very averse to working from home, because they were worried that people were sitting at home watching TV. In my experience, working from home was the most productive day of my week, because I wasn't just getting a cup of sugar or every 5 seconds, but then I could concentrate without, having that annoyance. So for some of them, working from home has actually had benefits, but alongside it came all of these challenges with work expectations. And then it's this bit around trust and protection. As I said, what remote work has done, it shifted it into home spaces. And so now there's this fluidity of what we used to be able to differentiate and have boundaries between home life and work life. We're seeing this fluidity. And so we're also seeing organizations who are now concerned about people who are working from home. And what does this mean, for underperformers? How do we manage them? And so now we've got surveillance cameras being put in. But then we also got this logging in and logging out. And so we've had one respondent say we need to redesign work to reduce presenteeism, that somebody needs to actually log in, and then only we know whether they're actually working. That if we have sort of, work outcomes have got to produce, they be trusted as employees to do the right thing, right? So how are we going to measure productivity? A UK study undertaken last year by the Institute of Employment said 48% of their respondents reported working longer and working irregular hours. So what we're finding that alongside the benefits of flexible work arrangement sit all of these challenges. But then what some polls, and this was one that was undertaken by IBM and had respondents, executives were almost about 3,000 who had responded, and then a fair number of employees. But what you can see from here is the differences in their responses. While employers seem to be more positive in terms of looking at the impacts on working from home, that's less so for employees and their experiences. And this is only 2020, so it's all very new for us. For instance, believing that the organization is helping staff learn skills needed to work away in a new space. While employees said yes, we've been helping them. Employees, on the other hand, half of them, as compared to employers, are saying, no, we don't really believe in that. When we look at this bit, in terms of believing the organization is providing clear guidelines and expectations with working from home or working remotely, while employees are saying yes, the majority, 86%, are saying, yeah, we do believe that we're providing clear guidelines. Only 51% of employees are saying, yeah, we do have clarity. This, of course, and I'll explain this bit in terms of regulation, has impacts when we look at the new legislation coming up in Western Australia with the Work Health and Safety Act, which talks about psychosocial behaviours and psychosocial hazards with role, not having clarity in role expectations, and having this increased workload burdens, etc. That is yet to be implemented in 2022, and that will show us a whole nother array of challenges that, will be something that will come up in the future. But let's just go back to looking at currently these challenges with flexible work arrangement. So we're going to do a little poll again, and I'll stop sharing and hand over to Lisa for her to share her screen. And so we'll, again, the results, and we're taking it, it's very anonymous. We just want to see what the stats are around these particular ones. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Kanta. Yeah, so everybody, get onto your Slido again, slido.com. Once again, JCIPP is our event registration. We've already had 9 people click their phones. I'm going to send mine right now, so that should be 10. So hopefully a few more of you are doing it, and we'll hopefully get some results soon. And Cantor will then reveal what this all means, like she did last time, very sneakily. I hadn't realised that's how she was going to go from the poll to the legislation, which was a great way of doing it. So please, we'll give you another 30 seconds or so. Just go to slido.com and there's a poll there. 15 people have already voted. That's great. Excellent. So give it another few seconds and then we'll move back. So Cantor, you can see some of the results there. You can sort of,
Yeah.
We're all overworked and we're all far too connected, it seems. I've just been on 5 days holiday up in Ningaloo, and I'm afraid I must admit every day I check my emails, and because otherwise I didn't. I had 50 emails at the end of every day, and I would have just been completely swamped. So I'm sure I'm like a lot of other white collar workers who basically spend a lot of their time checking their emails, and then and maybe they just can't stop the temptation to actually respond to a few of them. So I'm sure there's a few more people like that, not just me. Okay, I think we've got about probably enough there. Cantor, you got enough of an idea of the response there?
Oh, absolutely. This is really interesting. And so let's look at this. Start off right at the bottom. 0% of our 16 participants said they don't access their emails. That's because our smartphones have become so pervasive and intrusive into our lives, isn't it? So whilst we're busy using it and clicking to take on pictures and we're getting onto Instagram, etc., we equally so, and as John said, he was on leave, but accessing work emails. And so mentally, we're not really removing ourselves from that workspace. What's really interesting is that 81% of our 16 participants here said they respond to work emails outside of work hours. And that's a very significant number. And let's look at this one here. We've got 31% who said they check work emails out of work hours because the fear of missing out. You know, something's happening at work and I need to know what's going on. But then there's this, which is a big one. 50% respond to work emails outside of work hours because colleagues respond. And therefore, there's this feeling. And that is what we're talking about, these signaling behaviors and career jeopardy. So Lisa, if you stop sharing, and then I will go on to mine. So this is very interesting, right? When we're looking at our workplace behaviors now, and this is where we're working outside of our work hours, and we're doing it for a number of reasons. One, we're looking at it because we are getting these emails, and so there's an expectation from our employer that we will respond. And then we also had 40% who said they were expected. So there's the subtle expectation, but the signaling behaviors that if I don't respond to emails, but my colleagues have responded and it's after work hours, then it's going to be seen as though I'm not serious about my work. I'm not committed. So there comes in this career jeopardy, which then comes back to a whole nother area of workplace cultures. And whose responsibility is it, all right? But coming back to the whole employment regulation. So we've got all of this happening alongside this regulation. And so let's look at what's happening next. Comes this piece of legislation. And John, this is where I was getting to. So while you were on leave and accessing your emails, This is what's now taking place, and France in 2017 were the leaders. So France legislated the right to disconnect legislation, right? They brought in this. Organizations with at least 50 employees must negotiate agreements with unions allowing employees to disconnect from work technology. Because with our smartphones, we're finding these things popping up, right? So if the parties don't reach an agreement, the employer must establish a right to disconnect policy on after hours technology use. And so probably some of you are already seeing this, where at the end of an email, you are getting someone saying, I don't expect you to respond today. And when you get back to the workplace, then, you can. So you're receiving these emails on a Saturday telling you, well, look, I don't expect responses, right? So France has basically come up with this piece of legislation since 2017. What we are then seeing is that Spain has been talking about this and bringing in parts of it. Ireland in 2021, and because of this mass shift to remote work, has actually started with the legislation and the right to disconnect. Now, as we just see with this right to request for flexible arrangement and how broad this is, what happens if there's a failure to actually adhere to this piece of legislation? So let's look at a case that went through to France's High Court. This was actually the French wing of the UK pest control firm, which was ordered to pay a former employee who was a regional director 60,000 euros as back payment. So I'll give you a little context to this particular case that had happened. The regional director, who was based in France, was expected to be on call. And after being dismissed from his particular employment, he took up the case with the High Court and said that he was not paid for those times, but expected to be on call because of being, expected to respond to emails, etc. And given that there was this piece of legislation with the right to disconnect, which means after a certain point in time, during this weekend period, no email should be sent. And so the High Court then went back and said, for all of those hours that this person is expected to be on call, there should be payment. Otherwise, it would be wage theft. And in calculating it, this was the back payment that was given. Where does this sit with other countries then? So the Minister for Enterprise and Employment, and who was Ireland's former Prime Minister as well, basically said that the right to disconnect would give employees the entitlement to switch off. Now, while it is protection and beneficial to the employee, employers are also seeing the benefit of it. So although, and it's more recently that Germany is also looking at the right to disconnect legislation, but if we go back in 2014, Daimler, which is the German vehicle manufacturer, had this bit where they, rather than somebody going off on leave and having this auto reply or out of office reply, they actually asked their employees who were going on leave to have this automatic deletion of emails. So what their basic CEO said, it's not pure altruism that we're doing this, as the company explained. The aim of the project is to maintain the balance between work and home life. And so it's to safeguard the performance in the long run. So they are seeing the health benefits to this entire bit in terms of how it then helps the organization with, productivity, etc. So there's benefits for, if you're looking at it from a state level, for having healthy citizens, for the organization in terms of having healthy employees who come back after weekend feeling a bit more relaxed. And then, of course, for the individual to have that time and not have this expectation to be switching on or to be responding. But of course, like you said, there's a whole area and an entire domain around workplace cultures that need changing. And again, also this bit around workplace design that needs, shifting around. So where are countries sitting outside of Europe? Now, more recently in 2021, the European Union has basically come out, because we've got, a number of European countries like Spain, France, Ireland, etc., looking into this, including Germany. The European Union said that they'll be looking at it more widely from a an EU sort of piece of regulation, and moving forward have EU countries have this right to disconnect as part of their legislation, because it sits alongside the whole healthy workforce as well, and a healthy, population, especially because we are going to be seeing this increase in working from home. So coming back closer home, some of our nearest neighbors, Singapore, I've also been talking about this. So there have been senior members from the Ministry of Manpower, and Singapore, similar to Australia, uses a tripartite system of employer, employees, and the state bringing in legislation. And so the state in Singapore are in dialogue, because there are some members from the Ministry of Manpower who have been promoting the right to disconnect, while others are saying, but being a country with so many multinationals operating across different time zones, we need to be a little bit more careful in what we put into this legislation in terms of time. And so one of the very senior ministers basically said the government is observing how such laws are working out in other countries and how they are implementing it before Singapore decides to apply that as a piece of legislation. And so coming back home, we haven't been in dialogue, and there are a few of us who are working alongside colleagues in Europe, looking at how this is sort of playing out in Europe. And so watch this space where there's going to be a lot more research, and we'd be more than happy to be sharing that with you in the future. So this is where we said with the whole right to disconnect legislation playing out in Europe more than in other continents as such. But coming back to Australia, we're still grappling with this whole flexible work arrangements, and that there's a sector of the workforce that's actually left behind in all of this. So there are a number of areas that we need to be looking at, and we can see benefits, but we're seeing a number of challenges as well. And so that's pretty much where we are sitting with this bit. And so, John, shall we go with questions after this?
Sure. Do you want to keep on? Have you got any more slides there, or are you just about done now?
That's our last one.
Right. Okay. Yes. Well, happy to go to questions and answers now. If you can just stop the sharing, and then we'll move back in. Thank you very much. I'll try and get my head in shot. That's good. So once again, go to slido.com, and this time it's for questions and answers and comments, as opposed to the poll. Thanks, Candy. There's a few questions, some of which I've put up there, but there's also a few other ones coming through. One of my questions was, earlier on you talked about the pros and cons and the flexibilities about working from home. do you know, has the WA public sector decided work flexibility issues, do you know, on a collective basis, like a government centralised basis, or is it agency by agency? And the reason I ask is you can imagine as a government as a whole, you can see that they've got interest in public transport usage, the CBD, economic activity, so you can see why government as a whole may want more workers to work in the agency, in the city. But you can also see maybe why individual departments are quite happy for workers to work from home because of those productivity and other rationales you talked about. So in the public sector, where it sounds like it's not really so much the Fair Work Act, but more the West Australian Industrial Relations legislation that counts, is there any understanding from your point of view as to how the public sector is working in West Australia? Because I've certainly talked to people. I was very surprised last year in July. I think Mike Dockery, who's on the line as well, he and I went to a meeting with the Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation in the city. They've been working in the city the whole time through COVID, even though everyone else has been working from home. And one of the main reasons was the government said, look, we want you here because we need people, the cafes and the restaurants and the shops need to have some business, and we need people to catch our public transport. So at what level can an agency decide its own employee relations as opposed to the government as a whole basically saying by diktat, thou shalt come into work because we need you to catch the train?
Oh, John, that's a very interesting question. Because you see, with the West Australian Industrial Relations Act, it does have some coverage with flexible work arrangements, but for these particular ones that you're referring to, they would come back to what's sitting in the enterprise agreement. So if those particular agencies have got it in their work, in their enterprise agreement, this flexible work arrangements, then employees would be covered for that. The Department of Health has got it in their enterprise agreement that I'm aware of. And so some of them did use flexible work arrangements, but I suppose that will come back to a case-by-case basis. For instance, this very same reason, some of them would prefer this co-located workspace, and because they want to all be in there, and for reasons like a workplace culture. Whereas within the same agency, it might be that a certain division, they're all right to work away from that central workplace, but it would be in their enterprise agreement. That's where it's sitting.
So the state government, the treasurer or the premier couldn't come over the top of them and say it might be in your enterprise agreement, but really for this emergency situation of COVID, we want you to basically insist on your employees to come in because of other reasons, e.g. economic activity in the CBD needs to be upheld, so therefore we need workers in the city.
I suppose in some respect that can happen because it'll come back to the employer, right? And in this case, the employer is the state government. And so it will be, and again, if the enterprise agreement will have a clause along those lines, and it will depend on what's sitting in that enterprise agreement. If that clause is sitting in there, then they have every right to request that their employees come back.
Okay, sure. Right, we've got a couple other questions and comments here. Let's have a look. Someone was saying email is only one channel of communication. There are others that are more intrusive or insistent. So what are acceptable ways for employees to manage this, or employers for that matter? You mentioned about your right to disconnect. I mean, there's disconnect by phone, there's disconnect by email, there's disconnect by or whatever, Facebook messaging, you name it. I mean, what are the types of, and also, as you mentioned, there's the whole surveillance issue at home. So what are the, how do employees manage these sorts of things? And can you deal with the wide range of possibilities in an enterprise agreement? Can you actually write these things down? Because technology moves so fast, you could get left behind.
Now, I think, well, we certainly don't have that here in Australia, right? So I can only make reference to France's case, because that's where the legislation actually sits. If you're looking at that piece of legislation, they specifically make reference to being contacted during this period of time. So, for instance, if we go back to the case with the pest control, that person was required to be on call, not necessarily just responding to emails. So I suppose, and you're right, we didn't, 10 years ago, think about this right to disconnect, because we didn't have these sort of smartphones become so widely used. And now, as technology is moving, how do we capture it? And I think that's where probably having these enterprise agreements where, we go back every 3 years and revisit, that is where the opportunity lies to have clauses brought in for greater protection. I've been receiving a few emails from colleagues, like in the UK, and I noticed at the bottom of those emails would be, I don't expect you to respond now. So there's that kind of thing. But except that, I am responding because I've seen that email. So I guess it'll come back to my behavior. So, that little poll we said, how many of you feel the need to? And so I'm responding because I'm thinking, well, others who have been CC'd in the email, they've been responding. And if I don't respond, then am I kind of showing I'm not really interested in it? So it's both my behaviors, but it's also that expectation. And this comes under this whole area that is called chimera or chimeria, where you're looking at things like this concerted behaviors from our line managers, that our line managers are expecting us to respond because they've sent an email. And if we don't, then it's like we're not really committed. So, but that falls outside the purview of the regulation. That comes back to actual workplace cultures and leadership behaviors which need changing. What regulation might do is probably curb those behaviors a bit. I don't think it will sort of eradicate it altogether, because again, when we go back and look at this, what's reasonable business grounds, it's so vague and broad. Then how does an employee who is a vulnerable worker, and because the power imbalance has become so wide, how is an employee going to be saying no to it?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking about your comment then. What if you're trying very hard not to read all the comments that are going back and forth, but you can see the conversations going off on a tangent, and you say, okay, I'm not going to do any work now. It's Friday evening. It's 6 o'clock. I'm not going to do anything. But if you let it go, by Monday morning when you come in and the whole conversation's gone and you've done nothing about it, you can imagine, I'm just going to make a whole lot of work for myself. If I'd injected at 7:30 on the Friday night with a bit of information that was quite important, then I could save myself a whole lot of work on Monday. But if you don't inject yourself into that conversation, the conversation will go crazy. You get it on Monday morning and you have to sort of correct all the problems that have occurred. So a lot of things come down to workplace culture and team culture, from what you're saying. And yes, you're right. Even the mere act of reading the document is enough to say you're actually doing some work. And so people who write a thing saying, I don't expect you to read this, well, they're sort of saying, don't do as I do and do as I say, which doesn't really, isn't actually a great way of leading from the top. Anyway, we'll move on. One of the things actually was slightly related to that was a question about, it goes back to that French manager of the pest company. Are people, when that people are on call and they're getting paid, are they getting paid for doing a full-time job? I'm thinking about, people who are specialists or doctors who you often say, you see them on the weekend, they're on call in case an emergency comes up. I'm assuming they're getting some sort of payment for being on call, or are they only getting paid for when something happens and then they're getting paid full-time for the 2 hours it takes them or the 10 minutes it takes them to respond to that query? Or are they getting paid, if you like, a lower rate for a few hours just for the mere to recognise that they're on call, even though they're not actually doing any work unless an emergency arises? Is there some sort of way in which that remuneration issue is worked out?
For my knowledge of that, John, to one of our participants who've asked this question, there isn't any set kind of thing that again is something that needs to be negotiated. And if we're looking at the Australian context, it will be sitting within an enterprise agreement, which is where, you know, our union representatives who are acting on our behalf are so important in those respects. And that is where you would probably get, you know, the medical association coming in and saying, well, if I'm expected to be on call, and that's where they might have rates that they will negotiate with, let's say, you know, the Department of Health, who's the employer. But that will be done very much on individual basis within those particular occupational categories.
Okay, fine. Now somebody asked a question, quite a few people have voted for this question, which is, do you think the average hours are likely to reduce in the coming decade? And if so, will the 4-day work week become more feasible? Because that's obviously, it's a big movement that's on around the world about moving towards a 4-day work week. On the one hand, what's the likelihood of that happening? On the other hand, what does it actually mean in the light of what you've been saying about the inability of people to actually disconnect?
That's a very interesting one, and I'll share some research we're actually doing with the London School of Economics on the very same thing, because what's 4 days a week? So we were trying to look at it. The National Employment Standards in Australia sets down 38 hours as your work week, and usually the modern award or an enterprise agreement would sometimes give better conditions. For instance, some organizations will have it at 37 hours as your work week. But it depends on the occupational category. So we were just, and that's what we're trying to measure now by occupational categories. So I'll give you an example as a long way of answering that particular question. It's a bit more complex than just saying 4 days work week. When you've got hours as a measurement of time sitting alongside productivity that's expected. So somebody is expected to have 12 reports in, you know, or got a report that's due in the next 5 days. But that person has got in their enterprise agreement 37 hours that they will work, but the report is actually going to be taking them 60 hours to get done. Now, so do you see where this is sitting sometimes in conflict with each other, where you've got measurement in time, but we also work according to productivity outcomes or performance outcomes. So the report is going to take 60 hours, but the report is due in 5 days, but you expect it to work for 37 hours. How are you accounting for the balance of those 23 hours? Is that unpaid labor? And that happens in a number of white-collar jobs, right? So telling someone working for four days a week, we've actually been using the household income and labor data, because, you know, you've got over 22,000 households that participate in it. And we've been trying to measure, what does 4 days equate in terms of time? It's just been so varied. You've got people indicating that they work 4 days, anywhere between 28 hours right up to 60 hours. So it's hard to say what, unless we're going to say 4 days equates to 7.5 times 4, and you block it at that. But then if your employer is performance managing someone according to outputs, that's not going to quite tally.
I mean, of course, it's possible, I guess, to average it over a 4-week period or something, and so, and then you get time off in lieu, and those sort of issues are possible. But as you said, I mean, one of the questions was, are we talking really a white collar issue in terms of working from home or flexible work? Because there's more of a tradition of overtime being paid in blue collar professions, in blue collar occupations than there is in white collar ones. So a lot of it comes down to over what period of time you're talking about. Look, I'll move on to a couple of other questions that people have asked. Somebody was also mentioning the fact that work is or was a 9 to 5 places pressures on individuals. So why not work until 2 or 3 or have a 4-day week? And we've sort of talked about that. A couple of questions more about work culture. One talks about, can a group norm rather than a boss lead to new colleagues feeling a need to respond to after hours emails, because that appears to be the done thing. So it's a lot of things about the individual workplace and the group culture. And then that leads to also this question about managing knowledge work or invisible work, which is not often done well at work. So how do managers adapt to these new norms of remote work? So there's how do managers adapt, as well as how do group work teams adapt to this sort of thing. I mean, yes, there's regulation can do so much, but in the informal regulation of work, has your research been talking about that at all, about how other managers are doing things, or how work teams themselves do things?
And so we've been trying to measure this bit about at what point, you know, with the work days, you reach sort of, it starts having negative consequences on mental health or physical health, right? And so that's what we've been trying to measure in our research. But this bit around workplace or team behaviors would come back again to how they're being performance managed. You know, a lot of it comes back to, tell me how I am being remunerated and I'll tell you how I'm going to be behaving. So if there's this workplace expectations around, you know, promotions being tied to certain outcomes, then you're going to find this bit about career jeopardy, where people are afraid of not performing to that. And that is what will drive these sort of behaviors as well. So I guess it's going to come back to looking at it more, you know, systematically rather than in isolation as well.
Okay. Another question. Somebody, good point. Someone says, you're out in the 4 days. Your poll indicates that most of us are actually working 24/7, which is probably 24, which is probably true. So we'll have to do better. I'll make sure we finish by 5:15, okay, so we can get home. One question here about the complaint about working from home from the private sector is mainly that it might be bad for productivity, which is what you've just been mentioning a little bit. So is there any evidence on whether work from home is good or bad for productivity and for performance outcome, or maybe depends on who you ask? Just like the IBM survey there, what were the employers saying, oh, look, we're doing such a great job and it's working terrifically, and the employees saying, well, maybe not so much. So is there any evidence from your work or from what you've seen as to the outputs, outcomes from a productivity or a performance basis?
Now, that's a good one, John, because the World Economic Forum just released one talking about the improvement, but they've been looking at it more from European countries. And so I think this comes under that whole Eurostats, where they've actually seen positive outcomes with this. The New Zealand case that tested, that was just a single organization that tested it, and they found that shortening the work week actually led to greater productivity. There's also another study that was done. This was by Bandiera from the London School of Economics, and they measured it and showed that this was Oxford University. Camrada did this in 2019 with some colleagues, and they used the UK labour data, and they showed that, you know, just working a few hours helps people improve their mental health, and that in turn helps with productivity. But they don't show about excessive work in their case. So I suppose what we can go back to would be more the New Zealand case, where a single organization trialed it and said, yes, they've seen, you know, improved productivity outcomes.
Sure. If anybody, people go to the Future Work Institute, who've given a talk before Sharon Parker about this time last year, they've done a lot of work on work design, and they're doing a big survey on this sort of stuff too. So we'll keep an eye out for the answers and the responses from those people. What have I got here? almost done on our questions. So you did a survey. So when you put your when you send your PowerPoints through to us, we put them up. It might be a good idea to maybe put some maybe one more slide, get you to put some interesting reading or further reading that people might be interested in looking at some of the surveys and some of the write-ups of some of this stuff, because you mentioned a couple of cases which would be very interesting for people to check out, I'm sure, if you could do that. I mean, our own organisation, by the way, I mean, again, a white collar, knowledge work organisation, where it's often hard to know when is somebody at work and when is somebody not at work. I mean, if you're an academic like you or myself, I mean, when you go to work tomorrow, when you go home tomorrow, and tomorrow morning you read the Australian newspaper, and there's a whole section at the back of one of the sections on, future work. I mean, you read that. Are you at work, or are you at leisure on the weekend sipping a cup of coffee? I mean, it's very hard to know how you separate out your work life from your home life. So I mean, while I'm very sympathetic to it, and maybe I'd like to hear you maybe as a conclusion, the same time we've moved to the ideas of having a 4-day work week and reducing our working hours, which all makes perfect sense because working hours have been increasing in many areas, has happened at the very same time when it's so much easier to work all the time. So how do we draw that firm boundary between work and non-work, or is it just too hard to draw that firm boundary? I mean, where does regulation have to come in as opposed to just working it out at the workplace?
And that I think is the interesting part and the challenging part. So just to go back, and I didn't want to go too much into detail because with that in this particular presentation, because we were talking about flexible work arrangement. Well, what is an important thing, and that's coming out? We're talking about regulation. Remember in Western Australia, we've introduced the Work Health and Safety Act, and that just got passed in March of this year. Will be implemented in 2022, but some big changes there include the industrial manslaughter aspect to it, and that will be physical injury, right? But alongside it sits this entire bit about psychological harm. Now, when they look at some of the psychosocial aspects, they're looking at things like work overload, right? So workload. And when you're talking about work, having this excessive workload, then, and that becomes a test case for somebody overworking. We don't know what's it going to play like, because that's only going to be effected in 2022. It's then that we're going to be looking back and saying something needs to be changing here. So that's where probably regulation is going to drive this from a health perspective. And you would hope that then you're going to get, in terms of legislation coming in, where the government is going to be saying, well, we either have this legislation to save on our healthcare costs because of the number of claims we're getting around, mental health, etc., impacts, which then is going to force employers to revisit what this whole workload is going to be like. Interestingly, just last week, the World Health Organization released their findings that Australian workers, and men at that, are some of the highest number of workers who are working more than their 38 hours. So they're working in excess of 60 hours. And that's a very interesting one. So again, I suppose it would come back to more probably white collar workers, but we probably haven't had cases actually get tested. And when that starts happening, where, we're going to be getting employees coming back and saying there was this expectation and it was the work culture driving it. We don't know how many times does someone have to report that they've got work overload before it's seen as a psychosocial hazard, and that it gets tested out in court.
Okay, well, let's hope that nobody who's watching this is going to be that person in the test case, but be interesting to watch it when it does eventually come up, and almost certainly will. So, look, Cantor, can I say thanks very much for your presentation today? It was really great, and we learned a lot. And as I said, we'll put the presentation up on our website soon. We might just get Cantor to maybe add a slide of some